For centuries, a single question has sparked heated arguments. Did Africans sell their own people into slavery? Some say yes, blaming African rulers for their role in the transatlantic slave trade. Others say no, pointing the finger solely at European colonizers. But the truth is not that simple. What if I told you that Africa was not one unified land, but a continent of powerful empires, each fighting for survival? That slavery, long before the Europeans arrived, was a practice that shaped political alliances, wars, and economies? And most importantly, what if the way this history is told today benefits someone, but not the descendants of those who suffered? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew. Before we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we need to understand Africa as it was: strong, powerful, and complex. Forget the myth that Africa was a land of scattered villages with no civilization. That's the first lie they told you. Long before Greece or Rome, Egypt stood as one of the world's greatest civilizations. With advanced architecture, mathematics, and governance, the Egyptians built massive pyramids and developed one of the earliest writing systems, hieroglyphics. They mastered irrigation along the Nile, making agriculture their backbone, and traded gold, papyrus, and linen across Africa and the Mediterranean. Moving west, the region now known as Nigeria was home to advanced societies like the Nok civilization, famous for its ironworking as early as 1000 BC. Then came the Benin and Oyo empires. Benin was known for its massive city walls, some stretching 16,000 kilometers, longer than the Great Wall of China. The Benin bronzes, intricate sculptures, showcased their artistic and metallurgical brilliance. Trade routes connected them to North Africa and beyond, proving they weren't isolated before European contact. To the northwest, the Mali Empire rose under leaders like Mansa Musa, the richest man in history. Controlling vast gold and salt mines, Mali's wealth fueled an intellectual and cultural boom in cities like Timbuktu, home to the famous Sankore University. Traders from across the world, Arabia, Asia, and even Europe, sought Mali's riches. But within this greatness, there was also conflict, rivalries between kingdoms, wars for power, and a long history of servitude. Slavery in Africa did exist before the Europeans arrived, but it wasn't the brutal, lifelong, race-based system that would later be imposed by Europeans. In many African societies, slavery was more like indentured servitude. Enslaved people could marry, own property, and sometimes even rise to positions of power. Most African societies enslaved prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors, but this was nothing like what was to come. When European demand for enslaved people skyrocketed, everything changed. The 1400s, Portuguese explorers arrive in Africa, followed by the British, the Dutch, and the Spanish. At first, they trade gold, ivory, and spices, but soon they want something else: people. At first, many African rulers refused to participate, but as demand grew and greediness of some African rulers, some saw it as an opportunity. Some kingdoms like the Dahomey and Ashanti began capturing and selling prisoners of war to the Europeans. They saw it as a way to strengthen their own power, but not everyone agreed. King Nzinga Mbemba of the Congo wrote to the Portuguese king in 1526, saying, "Every day our people are kidnapped by Portuguese traders. Our nation is being depopulated." But his cries were ignored. The trade had become too profitable. Here's where the story gets twisted. Some African leaders actively resisted the slave trade, fighting against European traders and even banning the sale of their people. Others, however, saw slavery as a weapon, a way to dominate their rivals. So did Africans sell their own people? The answer is complicated. In their eyes, they weren't selling their own people. They were selling prisoners, criminals, and outsiders from rival tribes. Africa was not a single nation, but a continent of competing empires. But what they didn't realize was that they were fueling a machine far bigger than they could ever imagine. Here's what they don't tell you. While some African rulers participated, the Europeans controlled the trade. They built the forts, provided the weapons, and dictated the terms. Without European demand, there would be no mass transatlantic slave trade. Europeans didn't just buy slaves, they encouraged wars between African kingdoms, destabilizing entire regions to get more captives. And once enslaved people were taken, they faced horrors beyond imagination. The Middle Passage was a death sentence for many. Crammed into ships like cargo, with disease, filth, and abuse, nearly 2 million Africans died before even reaching the Americas. And those who survived, they were stripped of their names, cultures, and identities. So why is this history always twisted? Why do some people push the idea that Africans are solely to blame? Because it benefits those who want to downplay European responsibility. By saying Africans sold their own people, they shift the blame away from the systems of oppression that lasted for centuries. They ignore the fact that Europeans built an entire economy on the backs of enslaved Africans. The truth is, the transatlantic slave trade was a global system of exploitation. African involvement was just one part of a much larger story, one where European powers held the most control. The damage didn't end when the slave trade was abolished. Africa was left weakened, its societies torn apart. And when slavery ended, European colonizers didn't leave. They stayed, carving up Africa for themselves during the scramble for Africa. Today, the effects of the slave trade still linger in the economic struggles of African nations, in the racism that exists worldwide, and in the divisions that were created centuries ago. So did Africans sell their own people? The answer is far more complex than a simple yes or no. Some African rulers played a role, but the driving force behind the transatlantic slave trade was European greed and power. Now that you know the real story, what will you do with this knowledge? History is not just about the past. It shapes our future. And the only way to break free from its chains is to finally learn the truth.